Thanks again for the opportunity to give you an update on our technical coordinating committee, what's been going on in the past while. Just a couple of things quickly. For any of you who don't know, the Canadian Association of Broadcasters represents the vast majority of private broadcasters across Canada, including radio, television, specialty, and pay TV services. Our technical coordinating committee is made up of volunteer engineers from our CAB member stations, and our main committee chair is Denis Berriot, who you all know from Dual Media. Radio subcommittee chair Bill Stovall from Pattison Media, and TV subcommittee chair Wayne Rabishaw from CHCH TV. And just would like to point out, Wayne just told me last week that he's taking on a new role at CHCH and will be stepping down as our subcommittee chair for TV, and so we'll be on the hunt for a replacement for him. So most of our work that we do is through the Radio Advisory Board of Canada, because that's our main communication pipeline with ISED. And the Radio Advisory Board represents all spectrum users across Canada, the mobile operators, satellite users, fixed microwave, everything under the sun. And so within that, I chair the broadcasting committee. We have a couple of subcommittees. Our radio subcommittee is chaired by Rob Brown, also of Pattison Media. We have a Safety Code 6 compliance subcommittee chaired by Julie Bergeron of CBC Radio-Canada. And we set up a special subcommittee last year to review BC 22, which is a Broadcast Circular 22. I'll talk about that in a minute. Chaired by Francois Gauthier. So some regulatory updates. BC 22, as I mentioned, was a consultation with ISED to develop the experimental operation guidelines for ATSC3 in the TV bands. And so ISED published that based on, they incorporated many of the recommendations from Francois' subcommittee, and published that document in June. So any television operators who are interested in experimenting with ATSC3 are able to do so. CPC 2-0-20 is the Safety Code 6 site compliance and access control. Eric went over this in great detail yesterday, so I'm not going to talk too much about it, but just to kind of point out that it is something that you should really be thinking about and paying attention to, because this document was first introduced in 2013, and I expect that it's because of that ISED is doing an update and review of it. But as Eric mentioned, they're taking a direction, it would seem, of putting in more stringent guidelines that will provide some grandfathering for existing stations if they've already been deemed compliant by ISED, and then new stations, or if you make any changes to your stations, you would have to meet these new requirements. And a little bit of an interesting process this time as well, because I think we were very fortunate that ISED came to the REBC and did sort of a preliminary consultation with us to get some initial feedback. And so our technical committee prepared, quite a list of suggestions and recommendations of things that we wanted ISED to consider. That as well as input from other REBC members has been passed on to ISED. So they're kind of reviewing that, ingesting, and will then launch a formal public consultation. So that'll be, listed in the Canada Gazette notice, and anyone across Canada, the general public, anyone will be able to review what they're proposing and give their input. So we're going to get a second kick at the can at this, and it may even be quite a different document than what we've had the preliminary review, but definitely do take note, because this will potentially cost you money. if you have to make major changes to fencing, barriers, gates, other things at your sites. Also, GL08 is the guidelines for the preparation of Safety Code 6 compliance reports that you submit to ISED. That one is currently under review. The first meeting on that with the REBC will be next week. So just moving on to just a couple of other updates. The 600 megahertz TV repack status, of course, that was all completed in January of this year. But interesting to note that some Canadian stations did not use the assigned channel in the allotment plan when channels 37 to 51 were vacated. Everybody repacked down. Some stations elected to find an alternate station or different operating parameters than what was listed in the plan. And some stations, mostly in very remote areas, elected to remain on analog and do nothing. Although now that the repack is over, that means that those analog stations no longer have, license protected status. They still have a broadcast license, but they don't have protection from interference should something like that occur in the future. So a little more about ATSC 3.0, Next Gen TV, as it's being coined. As I mentioned yesterday, Humber College has launched a broadcast broadband convergence lab at their campus in Brampton, and they have already built up and are using their lab in the center there. And they should be very close to launching an over-the-air test bed, which will include a single frequency network of at least 3 transmitters in the Toronto area. I think a fourth one is potentially planned for downtown. And and things are starting to happen a little bit with Next Gen TV at the CES show in January. The consumer manufacturers announced, Sony, Samsung, LG, and Hisense, poised to ship 4.5 million consumer products this year. If you take a look in Best Buy, you won't find every model, but if you sort of hunt and peck, you will find some that already have Next Gen TV receivers built into them. Jamaica has recently adopted ATSC 3.0 as its DTV standard, and they were in an opportune position for that because they had not made a conversion to digital as of yet. They were analog up until this point, and they're now, I think half the island is now covered with ATSC 3.0, and the rest to come. So, I'm not sure that there's a great deal of interest or a business case for Canadian broadcasters to consider Next Gen TV right now, but it's definitely something that we should be keeping our eye on and watching how it evolves and progresses. You can see in this map, I think Perry mentioned yesterday that there are 54 stations on the air with Next Gen TV in the U.S. This map is showing that the orange areas are market areas that have Next Gen TV stations launched. The light blue areas are under construction, and the dark blue areas are are markets where at least one station has announced that they are launching Next Gen TV. So something to keep an eye on, and I think one of the things that will be interesting out of the Humber College lab, and particularly their interest in working with companies who are looking for a test bed to explore different applications for Next Gen TV is not necessarily the traditional over-the-air television broadcast, but all of the other business cases that you might be able to tack on to the additional data capacity that you have with Next Gen TV. So something to think about and watch. We'll talk a little bit about emerging radio platforms. Listening to radio. It's available on devices now that are primarily used for other purposes. Your PC at work, your smart speaker at home, your smartphone when mobile, and now the connected car. And our technical committee prepared a report to support the CAB submission to the CRTC radio policy review. A little frustrating, that was actually going back to January 2020 when that policy review was launched, and we still don't have decisions from it, and it seems to be holding things up. But in that status report about digital broadcasting technologies for radio, we summarized this multi-platform approach that many radio stations are taking, of acknowledging that you have to meet listeners where they are. And so if they want to listen to the radio on their PC or on their smartphone or or smart speaker, that's where we have to find them. So I'm going to talk a little bit about HD radio and hybrid radio and some of the work of NABA and NRSC. HD radio, Jeff and Donna covered this well yesterday, that in Canada there are 40 experimental stations, 39 FM, carrying 87 digital program services, and there is one AM HD station authorized in the Toronto area. They're up in 16 markets across Canada. Available in about 40% of new vehicles sold. And this estimate of 3.3 million vehicles in Canada is from earlier in the year. That is quite likely 3.5 or maybe approaching 4 million. To give context to that, there are about 25 million passenger vehicles in Canada. And new car vehicle sales in Canada typically run about 2 million a year. A little bit slower in the last couple of years because of the pandemic and supply chain issues that are going on, but that's the typical average. So maybe we're at about 15% of cars on the road have an HD receiver in them. Also, the FCC has approved all digital AM HD radio in the U.S., and a number of stations are taking advantage of that. And they have a different opportunity in the U.S. If you have potentially a struggling AM station, well, very often they have an FM translator, an FM repeater that's simulcasting the station. So that sort of facilitates the transition if you want to take the plunge and go all digital on your AM station. But one of the things that Xperi did a while ago and shared with us was a study of what power levels Canadian radio stations could potentially operate. And it's actually quite encouraging, really, that if you look at this circle chart, the light blue area, that the majority of stations would be able to operate at the highest HD radio power, minus 10 dB with respect to carrier. The smaller slice, the yellow, is that only one sideband could operate at minus 10 and the other sideband lower. And then the smaller slivers are ones that are more limited, that might be limited to only minus 14 or to asymmetrical operation only and potentially lower powers. But encouraging to see that at least most stations would be able to operate at the highest power, and that power level typically replicates your analog coverage to your protected half millivolt contour. So I wanted to take a look a bit deeper at what HD radio power levels some of the experimental stations in Canada were operating. And so through help from Jeff at Xperi and our friends at Nautel, sort of compiled some data of a partial sample of 32 stations that were on the air at the time, and 20 of them were operating at minus 10, 3 of them at power levels between minus 10 and minus 14, 7 at minus 14, and 2 stations at less than minus 14, and both of them with asymmetrical sidebands. So thinking about that's possibly for several factors. Some of those stations may indeed be operating at lower power levels to meet interference protections to adjacent stations. But also, because they're in experimental mode, there may be situations where a station is limited by their existing transmitter power, and possibly under, in an experimental license, weren't willing to invest in a higher power transmitter to be able to maximize their operation. Similarly, their existing antenna system capacity might have posed a limitation that might have prevented them from going to full power, or may not have been willing to take on the nominal increase in operating expenses for power consumption and ventilation for operating HD radio in hybrid mode. Hybrid radio is continuing to evolve. I've talked about this before at previous events. Hybrid radio augments the over-the-air signal with internet content supplied on a wireless mobile back channel. It's compatible with FM and HD radio, and really does a great job of providing a better presentation of radio by having station logos, really good graphics and text information, and also service following. And by that, what I mean is the ability for the radio receiver in the car, when listening over the air, and and you drive out of the coverage area, to be able to find that station and then transfer to the audio stream, and give the listener the opportunity to continue listening to that station at his option. And similarly, if you were, if that was your favorite station and it's on a preset and you're coming in from out of market, then you could be listening to the stream and then pick up the free-to-air coverage as soon as it's available. So Audi, BMW, and Mercedes have already incorporated this in some of their models. They've launched products in Canada, and there are two service providers. Radio Player Canada is providing sort of the back end to make that available to car manufacturers, as are DTS AutoStage. I had the opportunity to drive test an Audi to get a subjective evaluation of how hybrid radio works, and that's what those photographs are from, showing the station list with logos, and when you tune the station, then you get album art. So it's a very good radio listening experience. Unfortunately, we had to postpone the test because we did run into a roadblock. Had great help from Richard Sondermeyer on this project, who made sure that the one of the test stations, which was Indy 88.1 in Toronto, was configured properly, and we were constantly exploring to find out why we weren't getting the correct behavior in the Audi car receiver all the time. And it turned out a couple of little quirks were discovered that had to go back to Audi engineering to do some software fixes. So we're on hold waiting for feedback on those software fixes to properly recognize HD stations and be able to do the service following. And also in North America, hybrid radio, relies very heavily on your FM PI code, your program identifier code. So it's extremely important that all of your stations have the correct PI code, and that the service provider, like Radio Player, have that in their database. So that's how they can associate your station with the stream. Well, being a European company, Audi had this, well sorted out for DAB in Europe. Still getting some of the bugs out in regard to HD radio in North America, but I expect it's very close. But the other quirk in North America is that there are special PI codes for the public broadcasters. So the PI code for CBC Radio Canada stations, starts with the first character B, and which is also what the NPR stations in the U.S. use. So that difference hadn't been taken into account in their software. That was causing a headache. So we'll get back at that soon. But it is growing and developing, and it really, reinforces to us the importance of your metadata and making sure that it's right. And it's going to be more and more important as, to maintain prominence in the car dashboard, you're going to have to look as good as you sound. And that's where station logos and having visuals and text or information that are accurate and synchronized are going to be, important things to track. So one of the things that's very useful about that is that the North American Broadcast Association developed a radio in-car user experience guideline. Its purpose is to educate broadcasters and derive consensus and get us all on the same page, and to be able to share that with the automotive industry and get them, to share their feedback and get all of us on the same page. This was actually initiated by World DAB in Europe, who developed their user experience guideline based on consumer research that they did. And their findings, they found that listeners want to find radio easily in the infotainment system in the car. Once you find radio, you want to be able to find your radio station easily, for the list of stations to be up to date and to be easily, set as a preset in the radio, and to be able to keep listening to a station if it's available. Hence hybrid radio, to be able to hand off from your free-to-air signal to your audio stream. So WorldDAB developed their user experience guideline, and then NABA collaborated with them to take advantage of the work that they had started and then adapt it for the North American market. And so what they did, if you look at this table, it just identified some of the distinct differences between the European and North American markets. So the digital radio technologies, HD radio, as opposed to DAB. Discovering radio stations, the preference in North America is to list by frequency, but including HD multicast stations, within that listing, whereas the preference in DAB is to list alphabetically by station. A couple of the other important differences is that with service following, and this is primarily an issue in the U.S. because of copyright fees that you have to pay for streaming. I mean, we're in a fortunate situation in Canada, at least for now, that if you're simulcasting your radio station on an audio stream, you don't have to pay additional music royalties. You don't pay additional copyright fees for that simulcast. But in the U.S., they do, and it's expensive. So one of the features that the NAB, the U.S. broadcasters, wanted incorporated into this guideline was the ability for the broadcaster, station by station, to define whether they wanted a free-to-air zone that didn't include service following, and that they could then identify, where they wanted service following to be available within their coverage to limit the amount of audio streaming down there. So anyway, just one of the quirks of what went on. But the other important differences in regard to AM radio is that the North American guideline reinforces that analog and HD radio need to be available for AM in cars for the foreseeable future, and particularly in all electric vehicles, because a number of auto manufacturers have been, because it's difficult to do, have been excluding AM receivers from their cars. Again, that has been mostly from European automotive manufacturers, because AM is not a prevalent mode in Europe. Or what do they call it? Medium frequency, MF. They don't, there's not much of it left in Europe anymore. It's not mainstream. So, they've excluded that from their receivers. But we've reinforced that it is important in North America, and and the all-electric vehicles that are coming from Asia seem to have solved the problem, and it works well. Anyway, I better keep moving. A couple of things about the National Radio Systems Committee. We keep track of their activities and in terms of development of standards and guidelines. Last year, the NRSC published G203A, which is the IBOC time and level alignment guideline. And, and these guidelines are very useful to broadcast engineers. It's important to, take a look at them when you're looking for detail, is they provide good guidelines and best practices of how to keep the time alignment of your analog FM and your HD1 signal aligned. So it's a useful tool in that regard. The IBOC Digital Radio Standard is up for renewal, NRSC 5E. So that's currently under review, and the main change that's going to happen there is it will incorporate the advanced services and higher data rates that Jeff Deichweiler was explaining yesterday in his presentation. And the other that's under development is a metadata for streaming audio guideline. So again, it will just incorporate best practices for broadcasters to make sure they're getting their metadata right. A couple of things about emergency alerting. National tests have been aligned with wireless. There's 2 tests per year in May and November. Not all provinces and territories participated in the May 4th test, and including Ontario and Quebec. So that meant that there was a pretty large segment of population that was not included in that test. But for all provinces, they're struggling with whether to participate in these tests. Either, a while ago it was because of pandemic issues. More recently, it's been because of the proximity of recent events that have taken the public's attention already and provided, a de facto test with wildfires and flooding and tornado warnings. We had a tornado warning here that performed very well, certainly in my radio, driving here on Thursday. So, that's one of the reasons that, as frustrating as it might be for some of you, when not all provinces are participating in the national test, the reason is the proximity of, or the timeliness of other events that have happened in near time. Next test is November 16th. The Common Look and Feel Working Group has been renamed the Alerting Technical Working Group, and our technical committee continues to be involved in that to assist with resolving issues and improving performance. The ongoing and continuing education seems to be, an ongoing factor. Although, and I would say that, it's getting better all the time, but we are still getting, sort of erroneous alerts from time to time. A couple of current things. There was a security vulnerability published recently about some older DASDEC alerting equipment made by Monroe. And it's just a good reminder that to make sure that you've got all of the right software updates and security updates for your equipment, whether it's Monroe or Sage or anybody else's that you might be using. Alberta is making changes. The Alberta alerting, emergency alerting is integrating with NADS. They initially had their own, and if you are involved with Alberta stations, you'll be aware that AEA initially had purchased Sage NDEC equipment for all of the broadcast stations in the province. They've, a while ago, gave over ownership of that equipment to the stations themselves. And the next step of that, with this integration now into NADS, is that Sage equipment requires a firmware update to be able to work properly. So it only affects Alberta stations, but AEA are reaching out to stations and want to hear from you about how you're going to coordinate that firmware update. Regarding the national tests, there was some signal from some provinces that they would prefer to reduce to only one national scheduled test per year, and that I think will be discussed more at the September meeting that's coming up.